Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Lantern of Hollow Creek. The night was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Hollow Creek Campground was a small, secluded slice of wilderness, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. It was the perfect spot for four friends looking to escape the grind of their daily lives. The group, Mia, Darren, Kelly, and Chris, had been friends since college, bound by a shared love of adventure and late-night ghost stories. They pitched their tents near the creek, its soft babbling providing a soothing soundtrack to the evening. As the campfire crackled and popped, Darren leaned back on his elbows, staring at the sky. "No light pollution out here," he said, gesturing to the sea of stars above them. "It's almost too quiet, though. Gives me the creeps." Kelly rolled her eyes. "You're such a baby. Quiet is the point. You're supposed to relax." Chris laughed. "Yeah, right? Like you're not going to jump at every shadow tonight." "Shut up," Kelly said, throwing a marshmallow at him. As they bantered, Mia wandered down to the creek with a flashlight in hand. She loved exploring, even if it was just the immediate area around their campsite. The beam of her flashlight danced over the water, catching glints of silver as minnows darted away. She stepped over a cluster of mossy rocks and stopped when her light reflected off something unusual. There, half buried in the mud, was an old lantern. It was heavy and made of tarnished brass, with intricate designs etched along its handle and base. The glass panels were cloudy but intact, and inside was a stub of a blackened candle. "Guys, check this out," Mia called, holding the lantern up as she returned to the fire. Darren whistled. "Looks ancient. Did you find a treasure map with it?" Mia smirked. "Just this. Think it still works?" Chris reached for it, examining the candle. "We'd need matches or something to light it." "Let's see." He rummaged through his backpack and pulled out a lighter. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Kelly asked, her voice uneasy. "What if it's full of, I don't know, old oil or something that explodes?" Chris shrugged. "It's just a candle. Relax." The flames sputtered to life on the wick, and the lantern's glow was warm and golden, a stark contrast to the cold white of their modern flashlights. For a moment, they all admired its light. Then the wind shifted. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that sank into their bones and turned their breath visible. The fire sputtered, as if suffocating under the weight of the encroaching chill. A strange sound echoed through the trees, a low, mournful moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "What the hell was that?" Darren whispered, his bravado slipping. Before anyone could answer, the shadows near the creek began to coalesce. At first, it seemed like an optical illusion, a trick of the flickering firelight. But then the shadows took form. A man emerged from the darkness, his figure translucent and glowing faintly, like the lantern in Mia's hands. He was dressed in tattered miner's clothes, his face gaunt and smeared with soot. Empty eye sockets stared out from beneath the brim of a battered hat, and when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice was a rasping whisper that sent chills racing down their spines. "You've lit the lantern of Hollow Creek," he said. It's a beacon, a warning. You must leave before dawn. Kelly clutched Darren's arm. Is this some kind of joke? No joke, the ghost replied, his gaze fixed on Mia. The lantern binds you to this place. If you stay, they'll come for you. Who's they? Chris asked, his voice trembling. The ghost's form flickered, and he glanced over his shoulder, as if sensing something approaching. The shadows. The ones who took me. They'll drag you into the darkness, and you'll never leave. The group stared at him, frozen in disbelief. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the ghost vanished, leaving only the faint scent of sulfur in the air. We're leaving, Kelly said, standing abruptly. Right now. Hold on, Mia said. What if he was lying? This could all be some local legend to scare campers. Darren shook his head. Did that look like a legend to you? I'm with Kelly. Let's pack up and go. But as they turned to extinguish the fire and gather their belongings, they realized something horrifying. The forest around them had changed. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers. The path they had taken to the campsite was gone, replaced by dense underbrush. We're trapped, Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Mia said, gripping the lantern tightly. The ghost said we had until dawn. We just need to survive the night. The first attack came an hour later. The shadows that had seemed so innocuous before began to move, slithering across the ground like liquid darkness. They coiled around the fire, snuffing it out in an instant. Panic set in as the group huddled together, the lantern their only source of light. The shadows grew bolder, reaching out with tendrils that lashed at their legs and arms. Wherever they touched, the skin burned with a cold so intense it felt like fire. What do we do? Kelly screamed, tears streaming down her face. Mia's mind raced. The lantern, she said. It's connected to all this. Maybe if we put it out, or maybe that'll make things worse. Darren shouted, what if it's the only thing keeping them back? Before they could decide, one of the shadows lunged, knocking the lantern from Mia's hands. It hit the ground and rolled, its light flickering dangerously. Chris dove for it, grabbing it just as the candle threatened to extinguish. We're not going to make it, he said, his voice hollow. Yes, we will, Mia said, her determination cutting through the fear. Stick together. Don't let the shadows separate us. The night stretched on, an endless battle against the encroaching darkness. The friends clung to one another, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. Just when it seemed the shadows would consume them, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. The shadows recoiled, hissing like steam, and melted away with the morning light. The forest returned to its normal state, and the path reappeared as if it had never been gone. Exhausted and shaken, the group packed their belongings in silence. As they left Hollow Creek, Mia glanced back at the lantern, now lying abandoned in the dirt. She hesitated for a moment, then kicked it into the creek, watching as it sank beneath the water. None of them spoke of what had happened that night, but they all knew one thing for certain. They would never return to Hollow Creek, and they would never forget the miner's warning or the horrors that came with ignoring it. Story 2. Whispers from the Shadows. The Malone family, Tom, his wife Diane, and their 11-year-old daughter, Lily, had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. Tom had always loved the outdoors. Diane needed a break from her demanding job, and Lily just wanted to escape the monotony of suburban life. They chose a spot far from the usual campgrounds, a place Tom had read about online called Shadow Pines. "It'll be an adventure," Tom said as they parked their SUV at the edge of a dirt trail. The path ahead was overgrown, lined with towering pines that seemed to reach for the sky. Diane glanced at him skeptically, but said nothing. Lily was too busy snapping pictures with her phone to notice the uneasy silence that hung in the air. The hike to the campsite was harder than Tom had anticipated. The trail was uneven, and the dense canopy above blocked most of the sunlight, casting long, flickering shadows on the forest floor. By the time they reached the clearing, Diane was visibly irritated, and Lily's excitement had waned. The clearing itself was oddly perfect, almost too perfect. The ground was flat, the grass a vivid green, and a circle of large stones formed a natural fire pit in the center. Tom shrugged off the oddity, attributing it to luck. "Let's set up camp," he said, clapping his hands together. By sunset, the tent was pitched, and a small fire crackled in the pit. They roasted marshmallows and told stories, the tension from earlier melting away. Diane even managed to laugh when Lily's gooey marshmallow dropped into the flames. But as the fire burned low, the shadows around them seemed to grow thicker, almost alive. That's when they heard it, a faint whisper. At first, Tom thought it was the wind. Then he heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, soft and distant, calling his name. "Tom!" He froze, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Diane replied, her brow furrowed. Lily's eyes widened. It sounded like someone saying Dad's name. Tom forced a chuckle. "Probably just the wind. Let's get some sleep." But Diane wasn't convinced. "Maybe we should leave in the morning. This place gives me the creeps." Tom nodded, though he hated to admit she might be right. As they crawled into their sleeping bags, the forest outside fell eerily silent, the usual chirps and rustles conspicuously absent. Tom woke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispers. They were closer now, circling the tent, threading through the still air like ghostly fingers. "Tom, Diane, Lily." His heart pounded as he unzipped the tent and stepped into the darkness. The fire had long since died, leaving the clearing bathed in faint moonlight. The whispers seemed to recede, drawing him toward the tree-line. "Tom, come here." It was his own voice. A chill ran down his spine. He turned back to the tent, only to find Diane standing in the entrance, her face pale. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "I heard something," he whispered. "Stay with Lily." He grabbed the flashlight and ventured into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating branches that clawed at the sky. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "This way." He stumbled upon a strange sight, a ring of stones similar to the fire pit, but larger and etched with odd symbols. In the center lay a pile of animal bones, bleached white and arranged in a spiral. "Tom!" The voice was right behind him now. He spun around, but no one was there. His flashlight flickered, then died, plunging him into darkness. Back at the tent, Diane tried to calm a frightened Lily. "It's just your dad being stubborn. We'll be back soon." But Lily wasn't listening. She was staring at the tent flap where a shadow moved outside. "Mom," she whispered, "Dad's back." Diane turned, relief washing over her, until she saw the figure. It was Tom, but something was wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Tom," Diane said, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, and Diane realized it wasn't her husband. It was something wearing his face, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. She grabbed Lily and bolted from the tent. Tom stumbled back to the campsite just as Diane and Lily emerged from the woods, breathless and terrified. "What happened?" he demanded. Diane pointed at the tent. "Yeah?" He turned to see the tent collapsing in on itself, as if something inside was devouring it. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing from all directions. "Run!" They fled, crashing through the underbrush. The whispers followed, growing into a cacophony of voices that mimicked their own. Tom, Diane, Lily. The family burst into a clearing, only to stop short. The ring of stones loomed before them, the symbols glowing faintly. Inside the circle stood a figure, tall and gaunt, its face a shifting mask of shadows. "Welcome," it said in a voice that was all of theirs at once. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the whispers turned into screams. Tom grabbed a fallen branch, swinging it wildly as the figure advanced. Diane and Lily clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces. Suddenly, the figure stopped. It tilted its head, as if listening to something only it could hear, then faded into the darkness, taking the whispers with it. The forest fell silent. They didn't stop running until they reached the SUV. Tom fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and they sped away without looking back. Weeks later, Diane found a strange mark on her shoulder, a faint outline of the symbols from the stone circle. Lily complained of nightmares, whispers calling her back to the woods. And Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, even in the safety of their home. Shadow Pines had let them go for now, but it was only a matter of time before it called them back. Story 3. The Camper's Curse. The camper was exactly what they had been looking for, a vintage Airstream, all polished aluminum and retro charm. It gleamed like a silver bullet in the sun, parked on the lot of an RV rental place, just off Route 12. Sarah ran her fingers along its curved side as her boyfriend, Ben, worked out the paperwork with the owner. "She's a beauty." "Huh," the old man said, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. He was wiry and bent, his face a road map of lines and creases. His name tag read Al, though it looked like it had been written decades ago and faded sharply. "This baby's got history. You kids treat her right, and she'll treat you right." Sarah didn't like the way Al said it, as if the camper was alive, but she brushed off the chill that ran down her spine. They were heading to Whispering Pines Campground, a secluded spot deep in the woods. It would be perfect. Just the two of them, no distractions, no neighbors, and no Wi-Fi. They needed this trip. Ever since Ben started his new job, they've been drifting apart. They loaded their bags and groceries into the camper and hit the road. By the time they reached Whispering Pines, The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows through the towering pines. The campground was nearly empty, save for a few other campers scattered far enough away that they might as well have been alone. The camper's interior was a time capsule from the 1970s. The orange and brown upholstery clashed with the mustard-colored curtains, and the tiny kitchenette had a mustard-colored sink. Sarah found it charming. Ben called it a designer's worst nightmare. They laughed, the tension between them easing for the first time in weeks. That night, after a dinner of hot dogs and esmores by the campfire, they retired to the camper. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and the forest outside was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Ben fell asleep quickly, but Sarah lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the camper as it settled. Then she heard it, a faint tapping sound like fingernails against glass. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Ben," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Did you hear that?" He groaned and rolled over. "Hear what?" "Tapping. On the window." He sat up, listening. The sound was gone. "It's probably just a branch," he said, lying back down. "Go to sleep." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. She pulled the covers up to her chin and eventually drifted off, her dreams restless and full of shadows. The next morning, Ben was in good spirits, but Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the tapping. She searched the area around the camper, but found no branches close enough to have caused the noise. She didn't mention it to Ben. He'd just tease her for being paranoid. The day passed uneventfully. They hiked, swam in the lake, and shared a picnic lunch on the shore. By the time they returned to the camper, Sarah was feeling more relaxed. Maybe she had imagined the tapping after all. But that night, as they lay in bed, it started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, Ben heard it too. He bolted upright, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" They both stared at the window above the kitchenette. The sound was coming from outside, but the curtains were drawn, and neither of them wanted to move to pull them back. Tap, tap, tap. It was more insistent now, like someone or something was demanding to be let in. "Stay here," Ben whispered, grabbing the flashlight from the bedside table. He crept to the door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. Sarah watched through the window as he scanned the area with the flashlight beam. There was nothing there. "It's just the wind," he said when he came back inside, though his voice lacked conviction. He locked the door and climbed back into bed. Neither of them slept much that night. The next day, Sarah insisted they leave. "This place is creepy," she said. "Let's just go home." Ben sighed. "It's just your imagination. But if it'll make you feel better, we can cut the trip short." They packed up their things and hitched the camper to Ben's truck. But as they started to pull out of the campground, the engine stalled. Ben cursed and tried to restart it, but the truck wouldn't budge. They were stranded. "Great," Sarah muttered, crossing her arms. "Now what?" "I'll call for a tow truck," Ben said, pulling out his phone. But there was no signal. They were completely cut off. They spent the afternoon trying to fix the truck, but nothing worked. As night fell, they had no choice but to spend another night in the camper. That's when the nightmares began. Sarah dreamed of a man with hollow eyes and a face twisted in anguish. He was standing in the camper, staring at her with a look that made her skin crawl. When she woke, she was drenched in sweat. Ben was sitting up in bed, his face pale. "I saw him," he said. "In my dream. A man. He was here." Sarah's blood ran cold. "I saw him too." Over the next few days, the camper seemed to come alive. Lights flickered. The radio turned on by itself, playing static-filled tunes. Objects moved when no one was looking. The tapping returned, louder and more insistent than before. Desperate, Sarah started searching the camper for answers. In one of the overhead compartments, she found an old, water-stained journal. The entries were scrawled in shaky handwriting and detailed the life of a man named Henry, who had owned the camper decades ago. The final entry made her stomach churn. "They're coming for me. I can hear them at night, tapping on the windows. I thought I could escape, but they followed me here. If you're reading this, it's already too late." Sarah showed the journal to Ben. "We need to get out of here," she said. "Now." But the camper had other plans. That night, the tapping escalated into pounding. Shadows flitted across the windows, and the air inside grew suffocatingly cold. They huddled together on the bed, clutching each other as the walls seemed to close in. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The silence was worse. Then the door creaked open, though they were certain they had locked it. Henry's ghost stepped inside, his hollow eyes fixed on them. "You should have left," he rasped. "Now you're trapped just like me." The camper's lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Their screams echoed through the forest, but no one was around to hear them. When park rangers found the camper days later, it was empty. The truck still wouldn't start, and there was no sign of Sarah or Ben. But the camper's windows were smeared with handprints from the inside. Story 4. Blood Moon Ritual. The van rumbled down the gravel road, its headlights slicing through the thickening dusk. Inside, the 6 teenagers were alive with the kind of energy that only comes from freedom. A weekend in the woods without parents, rules, or expectations. Mike, the self-proclaimed leader, was behind the wheel, his girlfriend Jenna next to him, her blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail. In the back, Danny, Claire, Sarah, and Liam passed around a bag of chips and joked about who would scream first if they saw a bear. The woods were vast, dense, and ancient. Trees twisted skyward like skeletal hands clawing at the heavens. Jenna glanced out the window, shivering. "Are you sure this place is safe?" she asked, trying to mask the unease in her voice. "Relax," Mike said with a grin. "The only thing we'll see out here are squirrels and maybe a raccoon if we're lucky." The van pulled into a clearing where the last rays of the sun painted the trees in shades of crimson and gold. They unloaded their gear, set up their tents, and built a fire as darkness crept in. It was Sarah who first noticed the moon, hanging low and bloated in the sky like an ominous eye. "Whoa," she whispered. "The blood moon." Liam looked up, frowning. "That's tonight? I thought that was just some myth." "It's real," Claire said, her tone hushed. "The blood moon happens when the earth casts its shadow on the moon, turning it red. But some people say it's a bad omen." Danny snorted. "Oh, come on. It's just a moon. Let's enjoy the night." They laughed and told stories around the campfire, the light flickering across their faces. But as the night deepened, the forest seemed to grow darker, heavier. Jenna kept glancing over her shoulder, her laughter forced. "Did you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharp. The others fell silent. From somewhere deep in the woods came the faint sound of chanting. Low, rhythmic, and guttural, it sent a shiver down their spines. "Probably just some weirdo hikers," Mike said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Let's check it out." "No way," Jenna protested. "We should stay here." "Come on," Mike urged, grabbing a flashlight. "What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, the group followed him into the trees. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, as they crept through the underbrush. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and every snap of a twig underfoot made them jump. They reached a clearing and froze. In the center stood a circle of robed figures, their faces obscured by hoods. A massive bonfire roared, casting eerie shadows. In the middle of the circle lay a stone altar, slick with something dark and glistening. The chanting rose to a fever pitch as the figures raised their arms toward the blood moon. Claire gasped, and one of the figures turned. Beneath the hood, his face was painted with symbols, his eyes wild and feverish. "Intruders," he hissed, his voice carrying a guttural edge. "Run!" Mike shouted, and they bolted back into the woods. Branches tore at their clothes, the ground uneven beneath their frantic steps. The chanting morphed into a cacophony of screams and howls, echoing through the trees. They reached the campsite, panting and wide-eyed. Jenna grabbed Mike's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But as they scrambled to pack their gear, the air seemed to shift. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the clearing. Sarah's flashlight caught movement at the tree line. A hulking figure, its form grotesque and twisted, like something half-formed and wholly wrong. "What is that?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling. The creature stepped into the light, its skin mottled and oozing, eyes glowing with an otherworldly red. It opened its maw, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a roar that shook the ground. They scattered, instinct taking over. Jenna and Mike ran toward the van, the others darting into the woods. The creature lunged, faster than something its size should be, and Danny's scream cut through the night as it dragged him into the darkness. Jenna fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. "Hurry!" Mike yelled, shoving her into the driver's seat. The van roared to life, and they tore down the gravel road, the headlights bouncing wildly. "Where are the others?" Jenna cried. "I don't know," Mike shouted, glancing in the rearview mirror. The creature was in pursuit, its massive form bounding after them. In the woods, Claire, Sarah, and Liam huddled together, their breaths ragged. The chanting had resumed, louder now, surrounding them. Claire's phone buzzed to life in her pocket, though she hadn't turned it on. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "Sacrifice. Sacrifice. We have to go back," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We can't leave Danny. He's gone," Liam said, his tone hollow. "We need to get out of here before we're next." But the forest seemed alive, twisting and closing in on them. Every path led back to the clearing, where the robed figures waited. The bonfire blazed higher, its flames unnaturally blue. The creature circled the altar, its glowing eyes locking onto the terrified teenagers. From the van, Jenna and Mike watched in horror as the clearing came into view again. "We're going in circles," Jenna whispered, tears streaming down her face. The robed figures turned toward them, their chants rising in unison. The creature lunged, slamming into the van and flipping it onto its side. Glass shattered, and everything went black. When Jenna came to, she was lying on the cold stone altar, the blood moon looming directly above. The robed figures surrounded her, their voices a droning hum. Mike was nowhere to be seen. She struggled, but her limbs felt leaden. "The blood moon demands," one of the figures intoned, raising a dagger that glinted in the firelight. The last thing Jenna saw was the creature's face, inches from hers, its jagged teeth dripping with Danny's blood. When the sun rose the next morning, the forest was silent. The campsite lay abandoned, the fire reduced to smoldering ashes. The van was gone, and so were the teenagers. Only the stone altar remained, stained red beneath the fading light of the blood moon. Story 5. The Fog That Devours. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the kind of silence you find in the middle of nowhere. That soft hush of nature, a quiet punctuated by the rustle of leaves or the call of a distant bird. No, this was a suffocating, oppressive silence, the kind that made your ears ache and your pulse thrum too loudly in your own head. They had come to Pine Hollow for a weekend escape. 4 of them. Sarah, the self-proclaimed adventurer who always took the lead. Her boyfriend, Matt, who was less enthusiastic but loyal to a fault. Lila, Sarah's best friend, who had brought along her brother, Jake, after his recent breakup. The forest was supposed to offer peace, a chance to unplug from the grind of daily life. Instead, it offered this. It started as a mist, curling up from the lake in the twilight hours. "Pretty," Lila had said, snapping a photo as the fog began to creep along the shoreline. By the time the campfire had been lit and the first marshmallows skewered, the fog had grown thicker, pooling around their feet like some living thing. "Is it supposed to do that?" Jake asked, gesturing to the lake. The fog was no longer a soft haze. It had become a wall, opaque and unyielding, swallowing the far shore completely. Even the moonlight couldn't pierce it. Sarah waved him off. "It's just weather. Maybe it'll clear up by morning." But it didn't. By midnight, the fog had consumed their campsite. It moved like it was alive, tendrils of it snaking toward the fire, licking at the flames but never quite extinguishing them. The world outside the circle of light was gone. No trees, no stars, just a blank, milky void. "We should go inside the tents," Matt said, his voice tight. "And sleep?" Sarah shot him a look. "We're not kids scared of the dark. It's just fog." But even she sounded unsure. They stayed close to the fire, huddling together as the hours dragged on. The fog didn't lift. It pressed closer, colder, dampening the air until every breath felt labored. And then, just as Jake stood to toss another log onto the fire, they heard it. A scream, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. "Did you hear that?" Lila whispered, clutching Jake's arm. Sarah stood. "It's probably someone else camping nearby." "In this," Matt gestured to the thick fog. No way. No one would be out here in this mess. The scream came again, closer this time. A high, keening wail that cut through the silence like a knife. It sounded wrong, distorted, like it was being pulled apart by the fog itself. We can't just sit here, Sarah said. What if someone needs help? And what if it's a trap? Matt countered. We don't know what's out there. Sarah grabbed the flashlight. I'm going. Jake sighed. Wait, I'll come with you. You're both insane, Matt muttered, but he didn't stop them. The fog swallowed them almost immediately. One step beyond the firelight, and the campsite was gone. Sarah held the flashlight in front of her, the beam cutting a narrow path through the swirling white. This is stupid, Jake said, his voice tight. We should go back. Just a little further, Sarah said. The scream came again, much closer now. Too close. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, echoing unnaturally. That's not right, Jake said, stopping in his tracks. That's not. Something moved in the fog ahead of them. A shape, indistinct and shifting, like a shadow cast by no light. Sarah swung the flashlight toward it, but the beam seemed to pass through, illuminating nothing. The shape moved closer. Run, Jake whispered. Sarah didn't argue. They turned and bolted back the way they had come, but the campsite was gone. The fire, the tents, Matt and Lila, all of it had disappeared into the fog. Panic clawed at Sarah's chest. We're going in circles, Jake said, his voice rising. We're trapped. The scream came again, louder this time, and they realized it wasn't a scream at all. It was laughter, twisted, guttural, echoing laughter that seemed to come from the fog itself. It's playing with us, Sarah said, her voice trembling. What is? Jake demanded. I don't know, she admitted. When they finally stumbled back into the campsite, Lila was gone. Matt stood by the fire, his face pale and drawn. Where is she? Sarah demanded. Matt shook his head. She went to the edge of the light. I told her not to, but she said she heard someone calling her name. And then he gestured helplessly at the fog. She was just gone. The fog pressed closer now, so close they could feel it against their skin, cold and clammy. And with it came the laughter again, circling them, taunting them. We have to get out of here, Jake said. We can't stay. Go where? Sarah shot back. There's nowhere to go. It's all the same. Maybe. Matt's voice was barely a whisper. Maybe it wants something. Maybe if we give it what it wants, it will let us go. What does it want? Jake asked, his voice cracking. No one had an answer. By dawn, the fog had receded, but only slightly. It revealed what it had taken. Lila's scarf, caught on a branch at the edge of the lake. There was no sign of her, no sign of anyone. Just the empty, hungry fog, waiting for its next meal. As the survivors packed up, a strange sense of dread lingered. The fog might lift, they told themselves, but deep down, they knew the truth. Pine Hollow had claimed them in one way or another, and it wasn't done yet. When they finally drove away, the fog followed. Not close enough to see, not yet, but close enough to feel. Waiting, watching, and laughing. Story 6. Cabin of Forgotten Screams. The first time they saw the cabin, it was like it had materialized out of thin air. One moment there was nothing but trees and underbrush, and the next there it was tucked into the clearing like it had always been there. Ethan swore he saw it before anyone else. He stopped mid-stride, his boots crunching against the dried pine needles. "What the hell is that?" he asked, pointing. Madison squinted. "It's a cabin," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Good job, Ethan. You can identify basic structures." "That's not on the map," Owen said, holding up his phone. The GPS showed nothing but empty forest. No trails, no markers, and certainly no cabins. "Maybe it's one of those abandoned places people talk about on Reddit," Becca suggested. She'd been scrolling through urban legends during the drive up and seemed determined to turn their weekend hike into an episode of a paranormal podcast. "It looks weird," Ethan said. He wasn't wrong. The cabin's slanted roof seemed ready to cave in, and its windows were boarded up with mismatched planks. A faded wooden sign nailed to the door read, "OFF limits," in uneven, hand-painted letters. Below it, someone had scrawled, "Don't open," in black marker, the words smeared as if written in a hurry. "We're definitely going inside," Becca announced, already walking toward it. "No way," Ethan said, grabbing her arm. "You don't just walk into a place that says, 'Don't open.' That's horror movie rule number 1. It's probably just some hermit's old shack," Becca argued. "We'll take a quick look and leave. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words, Owen muttered, but he followed them anyway. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, and smelled faintly of rot. Dust motes floated in the narrow beams of sunlight piercing through cracks in the wooden walls. The cabin was smaller than it looked from the outside, with just one room and a single broken chair lying on its side near the fireplace. The walls were covered in deep gouges, like someone had taken a knife or claws to the wood. "Okay, creepy factor just went up by 1,000, Ethan said, standing just inside the doorway. Becca ignored him and stepped further in. "This place is ancient," she said, running her fingers along a dusty shelf lined with old, rusted tools. "Imagine the stories it could tell." Madison's voice was sharp. "Don't touch anything. This place looks like it could fall apart if you sneeze too hard." Becca smirked but moved to the fireplace, where a stack of yellowed papers caught her eye. She picked them up and squinted at the faded text. "Looks like a journal," she said. "Let's not read it," Ethan said. "We'll probably summon a ghost or something." Becca ignored him and began reading aloud. The handwriting was uneven, scrawled in fits of panic. Asterisk, "They won't stop screaming. Day and night. They cry for help, clawing at the walls, begging to be let out. I thought I could contain them, but the cabin is alive now. It feeds on their pain, and it's hungry. If you've found this, for God's sake, leave before it's too late." "Okay, nope," Ethan said, backing toward the door. "We're leaving. Right now. It's just a story," Becca said, though her voice wavered. She set the papers back down, but as she did, a low groan echoed through the cabin. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Madison whispered. "The wind," Owen said, though he didn't sound convinced. The groan came again, louder this time, followed by a series of sharp cracks. The walls trembled, and the air grew colder, the kind of cold that bites into your bones. "We need to leave," Ethan said, his voice rising. He grabbed Becca's arm and yanked her toward the door. The others followed, stumbling out into the sunlight, their breaths fogging in the unseasonably cold air. Behind them, the cabin let out a sound that was almost human, a deep, guttural moan that sent shivers racing down their spines. The door slammed shut, and for a moment, the forest fell eerily silent. They didn't talk about the cabin for the rest of the day, but that night, as they sat around the campfire, the silence between them grew heavier. Becca broke it first. "What if the journal was real?" she asked, staring into the flames. "It wasn't," Madison said firmly. "It's just an old cabin. People write weird things all the time. Then why did the walls shake?" Ethan asked, "Why did it feel like something was in there with us?" No one had an answer. The first scream came just before midnight. It was distant but unmistakable, a high-pitched wail that cut through the night air. Ethan bolted upright in his sleeping bag. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Madison groaned. "It's probably an animal." "That wasn't an animal," Ethan said. "That sounded human." The second scream was closer, louder, and joined by a chorus of others. Becca's flashlight flicked on, her face pale. "It's coming from the cabin," she whispered. "No," Madison said, shaking her head. "No way. That's not possible." But the screams continued, a symphony of agony and despair that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. The air around them felt heavier, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. "We need to leave," Owen said, grabbing his backpack. "No." They packed in record time, adrenaline fueling their every movement. As they started down the trail, the screams followed them, echoing through the trees. And then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The next morning, they reached the ranger station, exhausted and shaken. They reported the cabin, but the ranger's face went pale at the mention of it. "That cabin burned down years ago," he said. "There shouldn't be anything there." Ethan pulled out his phone to show him the photos they'd taken, but the images were gone, replaced with static and distorted shapes. "Maybe it's best you forget about it," the ranger said, his tone grave. "Some places are better left alone." As they drove away, Becca couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin hadn't let them go. The screams still echoed in her ears, a haunting reminder of the warning they'd ignored. And somewhere, deep in the forest, the cabin waited, hungry for its next visitors. Story 7. Tracks in the Night. The forest at Ravenwood was thick with secrets, the kind that whispered to each other in the rustle of leaves and creaks of branches. Jared had chosen the spot for its remoteness, a chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with his college buddies. By the time the four of them had pitched their tents and cracked open the first beers, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that clawed at the earth. The air was crisp, the kind that bites just enough to remind you that you're alive. Jared, Mike, Sophia, and Emma sat around the fire, swapping stories and poking at the crackling flames. Jared noticed how the firelight danced in Emma's eyes and felt a pang of nostalgia for simpler times. They were all here to rekindle friendships, but the unease in his chest told him this trip wouldn't be the carefree weekend he'd imagined. It started small, as these things often do. That first night, the woods seemed alive. Twigs snapped in the darkness, and something, an animal, surely, let out a low, guttural sound. "Fox," Mike had said with a dismissive wave. "They scream like that sometimes. Creepy as hell, but harmless." Still, Emma had scooted closer to the fire, and Jared couldn't blame her. The night felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Day 1. The first footprints appeared the next morning. Jared was the first to notice them, a trail of clawed impressions in the soft dirt, circling their campsite. He crouched down, running a finger along the edge of one print. It was deep, impossibly so, as if whatever made it had pressed into the earth within human weight. "What the hell kind of animal makes tracks like these?" Sophia asked, leaning over his shoulder. Her voice wavered, though she tried to mask it with curiosity. "Maybe a bear," Jared offered, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't right. The prints were too narrow, the claws too long. Mike snorted. "It's nothing. Probably just some overgrown raccoon or something. Let's not turn this into a Discovery Channel special." They laughed, but it was forced, a sound meant to reassure themselves more than each other. By midday, they'd forgotten about the tracks, their attention drawn to hikes and lazy afternoons by the river. But the tracks were back the next morning. This time, there were more of them, and they were closer. Day 2. Jared woke to Emma's voice, sharp and urgent. "Jared, wake up. Look at this." He stumbled out of his tent, the cold morning air biting at his skin. Emma stood by the remnants of the fire, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Around her, the footprints were clear and deliberate, weaving a chaotic pattern around their tents and leading into the trees. "What kind of raccoon walks in circles all night?" she snapped, her fear making her words sharper than intended. Mike emerged next, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stared at the tracks and then at the forest, his usual bravado dampened. "Okay, maybe this is weird," he admitted, "but it's nothing to freak out about. Probably just, I don't know, a coyote or something." But the unease was spreading. Sophia, who'd been unusually quiet, spoke up. "We should go. This doesn't feel right." Jared wanted to agree, but pride and practicality got in the way. They'd driven hours to get here, spent weeks planning the trip. Leaving now felt like admitting defeat. "Let's stay one more night," he said. "We'll keep the fire going, make some noise. Animals don't like that kind of thing. If it gets worse, we'll pack up tomorrow." Reluctantly, the others agreed. But as the sun sank below the horizon, casting the forest in a shadow, Jared couldn't shake the feeling that they'd made a mistake. Night 2. The night was alive with sound. The crackling fire, the chirp of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. Yet, beneath it all, there was something else. A rustling, faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the edge of the trees, just beyond the firelight. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered. Jared nodded, his hand tightening around the flashlight he'd brought out. The rustling stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the darkness. "Stay by the fire," Jared said, his voice firm. He stepped toward the edge of the campsite, the flashlight beam slicing through the night. The growl ceased, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then movement. A flash of something pale darted between the trees, too fast to make out clearly. What was that? Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know, Jared admitted, his heart pounding. But we're not waiting to find out. Tomorrow, we're leaving. Day 3. By morning, the tracks were everywhere. They surrounded the campsite in concentric circles, as if whatever made them had been pacing, watching, waiting. The dirt near the fire pit was disturbed, claw marks gouged deep into the earth. We should have left yesterday, Sophia said, her voice trembling. No one argued this time. They packed in frantic silence, stuffing sleeping bags and gear into backpacks with shaking hands. By midday, they were on the trail, their laughter and easy camaraderie replaced by tense glances over their shoulders. The tracks followed them. At first, they thought it was paranoia, but as the day wore on, the clawed impressions appeared more frequently, cutting across the trail and vanishing into the woods. By evening, they were undeniable. We're being hunted, Emma said, her voice breaking. Whatever it is, it's following us. Jared's mind raced. He'd wanted an adventure, a weekend to remember. Now, all he wanted was to survive. Night 3, they didn't set up camp that night, too afraid to stop moving. But as darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer, the air thick and suffocating. The growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through the night. Then another, and another, until the air was filled with a chorus of guttural sounds. Jared's flashlight flickered, its beam illuminating flashes of pale shapes darting between the trees. Eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the light like shards of broken glass. Run, he shouted, grabbing Emma's hand and pulling her forward. The group sprinted, their breath ragged, their footsteps pounding against the earth. Behind them, the growls grew louder, closer. Jared didn't dare look back. A scream pierced the night. Sophia. Jared skidded to a stop, turning just in time to see something. A blur of pale limbs and claws drag her into the shadows. Sophia. Emma cried, but Jared pulled her forward. There was no saving her. Not now. The growls were all around them, the forest alive with movement. Jared's mind raced, desperation fueling his steps. Ahead, he saw the glint of water. The river. This way, he shouted, leading the group toward the sound of rushing water. They reached the riverbank and waded in, the cold water biting at their legs. The growls stopped. The forest fell silent. For a moment, they thought they were safe. But then Jared saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the trees, their pale, elongated forms barely human. They watched, unblinking, as the survivors huddled in the river. And then, one by one, they stepped into the water. Epilogue. Only Jared was found, weeks later, wandering the edge of the forest, his clothes torn and his eyes vacant. He spoke of tracks in the night, of pale figures with claws and glowing eyes. But no one believed him. The forest keeps its secrets, and at Ravenwood, they're buried deep. Story 8. Lake of Silent Cries. The lake was a perfect oval, cradled in the heart of an old-growth forest. They called it Cradle Lake because of the way the mountains seemed to embrace it, shielding it from the wind. To Jacob and his friends, it looked like a postcard come to life. Still water reflecting the fiery hues of autumn leaves. The air so clean it made their lungs feel raw. It was their perfect escape from the grind of college life. No signal, Tara said, holding her phone up and twirling in place. Her face twisted in mock despair. Guess we'll actually have to talk to each other. Imagine that, Ben said, grinning. He reached for the cooler and popped the tab on a beer. 3 whole days of roughing it. Think you can survive, city girl? Tara flipped him off but smiled anyway. Jacob's laugh joined theirs, though it felt like an effort. The lake was beautiful, no denying that, but it was too quiet. No birdsong, no insects. Even the usual rustle of wind through the trees seemed muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. He shoved the feeling aside. This was supposed to be a vacation. A couple of hikes, some beers around the fire, and, if he was lucky, a chance to tell Tara how he felt. He wasn't going to let a little weirdness ruin that. The first night, the cries began. Jacob woke with a start, the nylon walls of his tent glowing faintly in the moonlight. At first, he thought it was an animal, a wounded fox, maybe, or some kind of bird. But the sound didn't fade. It swelled, wavering and high-pitched, somewhere between a scream and a sob. You hear that? Ben's voice came from the next tent over, low and uneasy. Jacob unzipped his tent and stuck his head out. The night was silvered and still, the lake's surface as smooth as glass. The sound echoed across the water, faint but unmistakable. What the hell is that? Tara's face appeared beside Jacob's, her dark eyes wide. Probably just an animal, Jacob said, though he didn't believe it. He glanced at the lake, half expecting to see something rise from its depths. But there was nothing, just that awful sound, rising and falling like a tide. They stayed awake until it faded, huddled close around the dying embers of their campfire. No one wanted to be the first to say it, but they all felt the same thing. The lake wasn't right. By the second day, the cries became the only thing they could talk about. It's just some kind of bird, Ben said, though he sounded less sure than before. He stabbed at his breakfast with a plastic fork, his eyes darting toward the water. Birds don't sound like that, Tara shot back. She hadn't touched her food. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her plate, restless. It sounds like... She trailed off, but Jacob knew what she meant. It sounded human, like someone crying out in pain or terror. Their voice stretched thin and warped by the distance. We're leaving tomorrow, Jacob said firmly. He didn't want to admit it, but the sound had gotten into his head. It felt like it was pulling at him, dragging his thoughts toward the lake. That night, the cries returned, louder and more insistent. They sounded closer this time, as if the source was moving toward them. Jacob lay in his sleeping bag, his heart pounding, willing the night to pass. On the third day, they found the campsite. It was on the opposite side of the lake, hidden by a dense wall of trees. They stumbled on it during a hike, drawn by curiosity and a faint hope that someone might explain the cries. The site was empty. A tent sagged under a layer of moss, its fabric shredded. A rusty cooler lay overturned, its contents scattered and unrecognizable. But it was the fire pit that froze them in place. It was surrounded by footprints, some small, some large, and they didn't just lead to the lake, they ended there. Jacob's stomach churned as he stared at the still water. The cries started again, faint but insistent, as if mocking him. "Let's go," Tara whispered. Her voice was shaking. Ben hesitated, then nodded. They turned back, but the air felt heavier now, the trees darker. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. That night, Tara disappeared. Jacob woke to the sound of her tent unzipping. At first, he thought she was going to the bathroom, but then he heard footsteps heading toward the lake. "Tara," he called, unzipping his own tent. The cries were louder than ever, mingling with the rustle of her movement. By the time he reached the shore, she was already in the water. Her face was blank, her eyes unseeing. She waded deeper, the water lapping at her waist, her chest, her neck. "Tara, stop!" Jacob shouted. He ran in after her, but the water turned icy cold as he stepped in. It gripped his legs, pulling at him, forcing him back. Tara turned once, her lips moving soundlessly, before the lake swallowed her whole. They searched for her the next morning, but it was futile. The lake was endless, unfathomable. Even the cries were gone now, replaced by an oppressive silence. Jacob and Ben packed up their gear and left, though it felt like a betrayal to leave without her. As they drove away, Jacob glanced in the rearview mirror. The lake shimmered in the distance, serene and unbroken, as if it had never taken her at all. The cries followed him in his dreams, though, and sometimes, when he'd wake in the dead of night, he thought he could hear them faintly, calling his name. Years later, he read a news article about a group of campers disappearing at Cradle Lake. The story ended with a chilling detail. The locals called it something else. Not Cradle Lake, but Weeper's Rest. Jacob never went back, but sometimes on restless nights, he'd find himself looking up the lake on maps, wondering if it was still out there, waiting, and wondering if Tara was waiting too. Story 9. The Watcher in the Pines. The campsite nestled in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains was supposed to be a haven, a weekend escape from buzzing phones and relentless work emails. For James, Rachel, and their friends, Alan, Lily, and Doug, it was a chance to reconnect, to laugh around a fire, and to breathe air untainted by smog. The first night was everything they'd hoped for. James told bad jokes. Rachel mocked him with her sharp wit. Alan strummed his guitar while Lily sang off-key, and Doug, stoic as ever, tended to the fire, ensuring it burned long into the night. The stars above glittered like spilled sugar. The towering pines swayed gently in the cool breeze, and the world felt peaceful. Until they saw it. Lily was the first to notice. She froze mid-laugh, her eyes fixed on the tree lean. "Hey, does anyone else see that?" she asked, her voice tight. "See what?" James followed her gaze. There, just beyond the flickering light of their fire, a shadow lingered among the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, and still as death. It didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the fire's glow danced on its edges. "Probably just a tree," Doug said, tossing another log onto the fire. "Or a trick of the light." "Yeah, sure," Lily replied, though her voice betrayed her doubt. She kept glancing back, even as the others tried to shake it off. The figure was gone by the time they turned in for the night, but it had left an unease in its wake, a whisper in the dark corners of their minds. The second night, the shadow returned. This time it was Rachel who spotted it. She had wandered a few paces from the group to refill her water bottle at the cooler. The fire's glow barely reached her, but it was enough to illuminate the shape lurking among the trees. "Guys," she hissed, backing toward the fire. "It's there." Again, the group fell silent. One by one, their eyes found the shadow. It was closer now, just a few steps beyond the edge of the clearing. It stood motionless, but its presence was suffocating, as though the air itself recoiled around it. "Who's there?" James called, his voice stronger than he felt. No answer. The shadow didn't move. Doug grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the figure. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing. The shadow wasn't there, or perhaps it had never been, but the oppressive feeling remained, thick and cold. "Okay, this is weird," Alan said, trying to laugh but failing. Probably some weird forest trick. Shadows and all that. But no one believed him. That night, they took turns keeping watch. No one admitted it, but they were all scared. By the third day, the tension was unbearable. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf sent them spinning toward the tree-line. Even Doug, the unshakable, seemed on edge. "Maybe we should pack up and leave," Lily suggested, her voice trembling. "No way," James said. "We're not letting some shadow thing ruin our trip." But that night, when the fire burned low and the forest seemed to hold its breath, the shadow appeared again. This time, it was unmistakably closer, just at the edge of the firelight. The group huddled together, staring in horror. "I've had enough of this," Doug growled. He grabbed an axe they'd brought for chopping firewood and marched toward the shadow. "Doug, don't!" Rachel yelled, but he didn't stop. As Doug stepped into the darkness, the shadow seemed to shift. It didn't retreat, but it grew taller, broader, swallowing the faint light around it. Doug froze, the axe hanging limply in his hand. "What the hell?" he whispered. Then, in a blink, the shadow was gone. Doug stumbled back into the clearing, his face pale. I couldn't move. It was like it was inside my head. That was the moment they knew they couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, they decided to confront the mystery head-on. Armed with flashlights, a map, and a reluctant sense of determination, they ventured into the woods, following the direction where the shadow had lingered. The forest grew denser as they walked, the pines towering higher, their needles blotting out the sun. The air was colder here, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, the heavy thud of their boots. They found the first clue in a clearing. An ancient, weathered stone, half buried in the dirt, etched with strange symbols that none of them could decipher. Surrounding it were the remnants of a long-abandoned campsite, rusted pots, rotted canvas, and a journal, its pages brittle with age. Alan carefully opened the journal. The entries were frantic, scrawled in a hand that grew shakier with each page. _ "The Watcher is here. It sees us. It's waiting. We should have listened to the warnings. There's no escape. The final entry chilled them to their cores. Underscore, it's not a shadow. It's hunger. A sudden crack echoed through the forest. They spun around, flashlights sweeping the trees. The shadow was there, impossibly tall, impossibly close. And this time it moved. They ran. Panic surged through them as they crashed through the underbrush, branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The shadow seemed to be everywhere, flitting between trees, its form growing more defined. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had arms, legs, and a face that was both human and utterly wrong. Doug tripped and fell, screaming as the shadow loomed over him. James turned back, grabbing Doug's arm and pulling him to his feet. "Keep moving," James shouted. They burst into the clearing where their tents were pitched, gasping for breath. The shadow didn't follow. It lingered at the tree line, watching. "Why doesn't it come closer?" Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "Maybe it's tied to the forest," Rachel suggested. "Like it can't leave." "Then we're leaving," Doug said. He didn't wait for a vote. Within minutes, they were packing up, throwing tents and supplies into their cars. As they drove away, no one spoke. But as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror, Rachel glanced back. The shadow stood at the edge of the trees, still watching. Years later, James would dream of that shadow, of its empty eyes and the cold hunger they held. He would wake in a sweat, convinced he could hear whispers outside his window. He'd tell himself it was nothing, just memories playing tricks. But deep down, he knew the truth. The shadow was still waiting. Story 10. The campfire packed. The forest was quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant croak of a lone owl. It was the perfect night for camping, the kind of peaceful evening you dreamed about when you thought about escaping the world. A group of 5 friends, Jake, Maria, Colin, Elle, and Sarah, had come to Blackwood Pines, a secluded area not far from the edge of town. It was a place they'd all heard about, but never visited, known more for its eerie atmosphere than for anything particularly sinister. But tonight, there was nothing to worry about. They had set up their tents along the edge of a clearing, the flames of the fire casting flickering shadows on the tall pines surrounding them. The air was crisp and cool, just the right temperature for a late-night campfire. As the fire danced, they sat around it, roasting marshmallows, drinking beers, and chatting about the usual things: schoolwork, relationships. It was meant to be a weekend of relaxation, far from the chaos of their daily lives. It started out as an innocent enough suggestion from Colin. "Hey, let's tell some stories. Like ghost stories or whatever." They all agreed. It seemed harmless enough. After all, everyone had heard the campfire ghost stories. Stories about spirits who wandered the woods, strange creatures that roamed the darkness, and the lost souls of those who never made it out. But none of them expected the night to take such a dark turn. Maria started first, her voice low and dramatic. "There's this place not far from here," she said, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "A place where people go missing. They say it's cursed. A long time ago, an old man came to these woods to tell stories. He was a storyteller, and people would come from all around just to listen. But one day, he stopped showing up. Some say the forest took him. Some say he became a part of the forest itself. Everyone laughed, not quite sure how to take it. Sarah took a swig of beer and leaned forward. "That's creepy, Maria, but I've heard worse," she said, tossing another log onto the fire. Jake, never one to be outdone, cleared his throat. "All right, if we're going creepy, how about this?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's a place out here near the old creek where the trees grow twisted and gnarled. They say that if you stand there long enough, you'll hear someone whispering your name over and over. And if you listen closely enough, the voice will ask you for a story." "A story?" Elle frowned. "What kind of story?" Jake shrugged. "A story. The kind you don't want to tell. The kind that's locked up inside you." The group fell quiet for a moment, the fire crackling louder in the silence. "All right, that's enough of that," Colin said, trying to shake the uneasy tension that had begun to settle over the group. "Who's next?" But before anyone could speak, the air around them seemed to shift. A sudden chill swept through the clearing, making the flames of the fire dance erratically. A strange feeling settled in the pit of their stomachs, an unsettling sensation that they were no longer alone. They turned, almost instinctively, toward the edge of the clearing where the trees loomed dark and still. From the shadows, a figure appeared. At first, they thought it was just one of them playing a prank, but as the figure stepped into the light, they saw that it wasn't anyone from the group. The man was old, bent and haggard, with long, gray hair and a tattered cloak that seemed to merge with the night itself. His face was pale, gaunt, almost as if he had been dead for years. His eyes, though, were sharp and alive, gleaming in the firelight. They froze, unsure whether they were seeing a figment of their imagination or something real. The man didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, watching them, his eyes lingering on each one of them in turn. Finally, his voice cracked through the silence, deep and rasping. "You've spoken the words. Now the story must be told." They stared at him, confused. "What?" Colin asked, his voice trembling. The man stepped forward, his movement unervingly smooth despite his age. "The story. You've called me here with your words. And now you must tell me a tale, a story worth hearing." Or, his eyes flicked to the shadows behind them. "Your souls will pay the price." Elle let out a nervous laugh, though it was strained. "This is some kind of joke, right? A prank?" The old man didn't laugh. His expression remained unchanged, his eyes piercing through them. "No joke. No prank. You have awakened the pact." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the edge of the log he sat on. "We didn't mean to summon anyone. We were just telling stories." The old man's lips curled into a thin, grim smile. "It's too late. The words have already been spoken. The pact is in motion." Maria's heart began to pound. Something about the man's presence was wrong. Her skin prickled, and she could feel the air growing heavier with each passing second. She wanted to get up, to run, but her body wouldn't move. What do you want from us?" Sarah stammered. The old man's smile faded, replaced by something darker, something hungry. "I am the spirit of stories. I feed on them, on the stories that are told in the dark around fires like this one. And now, you must offer me a story that matters, a story that bleeds." The group exchanged uncertain glances, each of them too frightened to speak. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. The old man's eyes never left them, his gaze growing more intense with every passing second. "Tell me a story," he demanded, his voice like a death knell, "or you will never leave this place." Maria, her voice shaky, spoke first. I don't know what kind of story you want." The old man's eyes narrowed. "I want a story that hurts, a story that you would rather forget, a story that comes from the deepest, darkest part of your soul." The group was silent. None of them had the courage to speak. Then, with a sudden motion, the man stepped closer to the fire, his face now illuminated by its flickering light. "The first story," he said, his voice like a whisper in the wind, "will be yours, Maria." She froze, her heart racing. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The fire crackled louder, almost angrily. The old man raised his hand, and the flames shifted, turning black as night, casting an unnatural glow over the clearing. Maria, trembling, took a deep breath. Her mind raced, her thoughts in a frenzy, but she knew there was no escaping this. She had to tell a story. I don't have one. I've never done anything wrong. I've never hurt anyone." The old man's eyes darkened. "A story, child, or you'll be the first to join the fire." Maria swallowed hard. She thought about it. Her story, her real story, was locked deep inside her. The one she'd never told anyone. It was a story she had buried for years, a story she was ashamed of, the story of a night that had changed everything. But now, with the weight of the old man's gaze pressing on her, she knew she had no choice. She had to speak it, or they would all be lost. And so, she began. The fire crackled louder, its light flickering and dancing as the old man watched, his twisted smile widening with each word she spoke. The pact had been made, and the stories had begun.